May 31st, 1223. The Kalka River, southern steppes of what would one day be called Ukraine. The morning sun climbed over an endless sea of grass, illuminating a scene that would haunt Russian chroniclers for centuries. Somewhere in that vast emptiness, two armies were converging toward a collision that would reshape Eastern Europe. On one side, 80,000 warriors, the combined might of the Rus principalities and their Cuman allies, confident in their numbers, certain of their strength. On the other, 20,000 Mongol horsemen under generals Jebe and Subutai, veterans of conquest that had already devoured empires from China to Persia. The Rus had no idea what was coming. They couldn't have known, because what approached them that spring morning wasn't just an army. It was a revolution in warfare, a tactical sophistication so far beyond anything Europe had seen that it might as well have arrived from another world. And in a way it had. The story begins not on the Kalka River, but in the court of Kiev, in March 1223, when an embassy arrived bearing gifts and warnings that would set everything in motion. They were Cumans, also called Polovtsians by the Rus, Turkic nomads who had dominated the southern steppes for generations. They were the raiders, the horse archers, the terror of the frontier, a people who had burned Russian villages and carried off slaves for decades. They were enemies, but on this March day they came as supplicants. Their leader was Khan Kutan, and he brought gold, silver, exotic fabrics from the east, horses, camels, buffalo, and slave girls, lavish gifts for the princes of Rus. But it wasn't generosity that motivated him. It was terror. Khan Kutan was Mstislav Mstislavich's father-in-law. Mstislav, called the Bold, Prince of Galicia, one of the most powerful men in the fractured constellation of Rus principalities. Kutan approached him with words that the Russian chronicles recorded. Today, the Mongols have taken our land, and tomorrow they will come and take yours, the Mongols. The very name was new to most Russians. Some called them Tartars, a word that would echo through centuries with connotations of Eastern menace. The chronicles described them as unknown nations, writing, "For our sins, unknown peoples arrived. No one knew their origin or whence they came, or what religion they practiced, that is known only to God, and perhaps to wise men learned in books." But Khan Kutan knew. He had faced them. His people, who had terrorized settled civilizations for generations, had been shattered by these newcomers. Two of his fellow Khans, Danilo Kobyakovich and Yuri Konchakovich, had died in battle against them. The survivors had fled westward, desperately seeking anyone who might help them turn back this unprecedented threat. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in that hall in Kiev. For decades, the Cumans had raided Rus lands. Under leaders like Khan Bonyak, called the Mangi, they had burned Kiev itself, plundered the famous monastery of the caves, carried off thousands into slavery. Russian princes had launched campaign after campaign against them. Vladimir Monomakh had organized coalitions, defeated them repeatedly, pushed them back toward the Volga. And now here they were, begging for help. For nearly a year the Russian princes ignored them. Old wounds don't heal quickly. The memory of burning villages, slaughtered farmers, children sold into slavery, these things don't fade because your enemy arrives with gifts and warnings. But then the reports started coming. The Mongols were marching along the Dniester River. They were moving west. Khan Kutan's warning was coming true. Mstislav of Galicia arranged a council of war in Kiev. It was attended by the major powers of the Rus world. Mstislav Romanovich the Old, Grand Prince of Kiev, nominal overlord of the Rus principalities. Prince Yuri II of Vladimir Suzdal, ruler of the wealthy northeastern territories. Mstislav Sviatoslavich of Chernigov, and others, lesser princes, each with their own armies, their own ambitions, their own grudges. These men had spent decades fighting each other. The Rus principalities were fragments of what had once been mighty Kievan Rus, a confederation that had dominated Eastern Europe. But succession disputes, family feuds, economic rivalries, all of it had fractured the realm into competing principalities that spent more time warring with each other than facing external threats. But this was different. This was existential. They agreed to an alliance with the Cumans. They would march east, find these Mongols and destroy them before they could threaten Rus lands. It seemed reasonable. The combined Rus and Cuman force numbered around 80,000 men. The scouts reported the Mongol force at maybe 20,000, 4-to-1 odds. The Rus had cavalry, heavy cavalry in some cases, armoured warriors who had fought for decades. They had infantry, poorly armed peasants and townsmen perhaps, but numbers. The Cumans brought their famed horse archers, men who had dominated these steppes for generations. How could 20,000 nomads from the mysterious east possibly stand against this? They had no idea who they were facing. Jebba and Subutai weren't random steppe raiders. They were two of the greatest military minds of the medieval world, generals who had already conquered territories spanning thousands of miles, who had developed tactical systems that would influence warfare for centuries. Jabi, whose name meant arrow, had started as an enemy of Genghis Khan. At the Battle of the 13 Sides in 1202, he had shot Genghis Khan's horse out from under him. After the battle, when Genghis asked who had wounded his mount, Jabi, then called Jurkoadei, had stepped forward and admitted it. "If you kill me," he had said, "I'll be useful to no one, but spare me, and I'll be your most loyal servant." Genghis Khan, who valued courage and skill, above all else, had given him a new name and made him one of his top generals. Jabi had proven his worth 1,000 times over. He had commanded the left wing in the invasion of Jin China, capturing fortresses through brilliant use of feigned retreats. He had hunted down Kuchlug in the Karakitai Empire, with only 20,000 men against 30,000, winning through speed and by inciting religious revolts. He had crossed the Tian Shan mountains in winter, through passes with 5 feet of snow, to threaten the Fergana Valley and draw out the Khwarezmian Shah's elite forces. Subutai was, if anything, even more formidable. The son of a blacksmith, he had joined Genghis Khan as a teenager, and risen purely on merit to become what some historians would later call the greatest general of the medieval world. He would direct more than 20 campaigns, conquering or overrunning more territory than any other commander in history. He was a master of coordination, routinely moving armies hundreds of miles apart in synchronized operations. He was an innovator who understood siege warfare, intelligence gathering, psychological operations. Genghis Khan had called him one of his 4 dogs of war, saying they have foreheads of brass, their jaws are like scissors, their tongues like piercing awls, their heads are iron, their whipping tails swords, in the day of battle they devour enemy flesh. These 2 generals had been hunting the Khwarezmian Shah Muhammad II through his own empire. They had pursued him from Samarkand to the shores of the Caspian Sea, where he died on a fishing village island, broken and defeated. With their quarry dead, they asked Genghis Khan for permission to circle the Caspian Sea and return to Mongolia via the Caucasus, conducting reconnaissance and subjugating tribes along the way. What followed was one of the most audacious military expeditions in history. 20,000 Mongol horsemen crossed through Azerbaijan, raided Georgia, defeated King George IV himself in battle, crossed the Caucasus Mountains, emerging onto the southern Russian steppes. They defeated the Alans, then the various Cuman tribes, methodically working their way west. By the time they reached the Dniester River, they had been on campaign for 3 years, fighting continuously, living off the land and plunder. They were exhausted, far from home, facing an enemy that outnumbered them 4-1. Any reasonable commander would have avoided battle, maybe even retreated. But Jebbe and Subutai were not reasonable commanders. They were Mongol commanders, and the Mongols had developed a system of warfare that turned conventional military wisdom on its head. The Rus army mustered at Pereyaslav and began their march east. The chronicles say they moved on 3 separate fronts, attempting to encircle the Mongol force near the Dnieper River. At Pereyaslav, they were met by Mongol envoys, who, according to the chronicles, tried to persuade them not to fight. The Mongols, they said, came in peace. They had no quarrel with Rus. Their war was with the Cumans, who had been their enemies. Why should the princes of Rus fight for the Cumans, who had raided their lands for generations? "Make peace with us," the envoy said. The Rus princes refused. Some sources say they even executed the Mongol envoys, a grievous violation of the diplomatic customs of the time. If true, it was a fatal mistake. The Mongols sent a second embassy. This one was also rejected. The Rus and Cuman alliance crossed the Dnieper River and marched eastward, pursuing what they believed was the retreating Mongol force. The Mongols fell back before them, day after day, drawing them deeper into the steppe. It must have seemed like victory. The fearsome eastern warriors were running. The Rus cavalry captured the Mongol rearguard, a force of about 1,000 men under a commander named Hammerbek. Mstislav the Bold led the attack personally. They destroyed the rearguard completely, killing Hammerbeck and most of his men. The victory filled them with confidence. These Mongols, they must have thought, weren't so formidable after all. The chronicles say Mstislav couldn't suppress his laughter. They pursued the Mongols for 9 days, the different Rus and Cuman forces spreading out across the steppe, each prince commanding his own contingent, coordination breaking down as the pursuit continued. They didn't realize they were being herded. On the 9th day, May 31st, 1223, the Mongols stopped running. The Rus forces approached the Kalka River, a small waterway in the southern steppes, probably what's now called the Kalmius River near Donetsk. Across the river, the Mongols had formed up for battle, ranks of horse archers, perfectly organized, positioned in formations that would allow them maximum flexibility. Behind them, the heavier cavalry, ready to exploit any opening. But the Rus didn't see a tactical masterpiece being prepared. They saw an enemy with his back to a river, outnumbered, vulnerable. Mstislav the Bold didn't wait for the rest of the Rus army to catch up. He didn't coordinate with the other princes. He didn't develop a unified plan of attack. He saw the Mongols, he had his Cuman allies with him, and he ordered an immediate attack. It was exactly what Yebe and Subutai had been waiting for. The Cumans and Mstislav's cavalry charged across the river. The Mongols fell back, firing their composite bows from horseback, the arrows falling in sheets but not standing to fight. It must have looked like another retreat. The Rus and Cumans pressed forward, breaking formation in their eagerness to close with the enemy. And then the Mongols turned. They had been executing a feigned retreat, one of the core Mongol tactics, a maneuver they had practiced to perfection. The Mongol formations wheeled, horse archers taking up positions on the flanks, firing into the advancing Rus and Cumans from multiple angles. The composite bow was a technological marvel, capable of penetrating armour at ranges that European bows couldn't match. The Mongols could fire accurately from horseback at full gallop, loosing arrows at a rate European crossbowmen couldn't hope to match. And they weren't firing randomly. Mongol warriors trained from childhood, practicing on the great hunts, learning to coordinate their movements, to concentrate fire, to create zones of destruction. The Cuman cavalry broke first. They were horse archers themselves. They understood what was happening. They could see the trap closing. They turned and fled, streaming back through the Rus lines, creating chaos and disruption. Mstislav the Bold's cavalry tried to hold, but the Mongols were everywhere now, flanking, surrounding, concentrating fire on the scattered Rus formations. The chronicles describe it as confusion, panic, a rout. Warriors who had never seen this style of fighting, who had trained to fight in formation with sword and spear and lance, found themselves being shot to pieces by enemies they couldn't close with. Mstislav's forces broke and ran, but more Rus princes were approaching now. Mstislav of Chernigov led his army across the river a short time later, his forces deployed in traditional formation, infantry in the centre, cavalry on the flanks. He was a veteran commander. He would have learned from what happened to Mstislav the Bold. But the Mongols adapted faster. They concentrated fire on the Chernigov forces, horse archers riding back and forth along the Rus lines, shooting at point-blank range, inflicting horrific casualties. The Rus infantry, lightly armoured peasants and townsmen, tried to maintain formation, falling back in some semblance of order. But the constant barrage of arrows was too much. The Mongols had brought siege engines, stone throwers that they now used to break up formations. The Rus had never seen catapults used in field battles. The psychological effect was devastating. Mstislav of Chernigov's 2 nephews fell in the fighting. Then Mstislav himself was cut down. His son Vsevolod managed to briefly maintain control, but when he too was killed, the men of Chernigov began a disordered retreat back across the river. At this moment, the remaining Rus cavalry launched a counterattack from behind the Mongols. The forces of Lutsk and Smolensk hit the Mongol formations, forcing them back briefly. It was probably the high point of the battle for the Rus. For a moment they had the Mongols on the defensive, but only for a moment. The Mongols reformed, and the superior coordination, the tactical flexibility that came from their decimal organization system, allowed them to respond faster than the Rus could exploit the opening. The counter-attacking Rus cavalry found themselves surrounded, cut off from support. They fought their way back across the river, but they had suffered heavy casualties and accomplished nothing. On the eastern bank of the Kalka River, Mstislav of Galicia, the bold, rallied the surviving cavalry. He must have been stunned. His forces had been shattered. The Chernigov army had been destroyed. Thousands of his men lay dead on the opposite bank, and he looked across the river to where Mstislav Romanovich, the Grand Prince of Kiev, sat with his army on a fortified hilltop, having refused to engage. The Grand Prince of Kiev had 2,000 of the best armed and most experienced troops in the entire Rus army. He had watched the disaster unfold and done nothing. The chronicles suggest he simply didn't trust Mstislav the Bold. The rivalry between the princes was so deep that even in the face of annihilation, they couldn't cooperate. Mstislav of Galicia swallowed his pride and begged for help. The Grand Prince refused. He fortified his position on the rocky knoll and prepared to wait out the battle. It was a catastrophic decision. The Mongols now turned their full attention to the fortified Rus camp. For 3 days they besieged it. Many of the infantry managed to slip away during the nights, the desertions continuing until dawn on June 1st, when the Mongols launched their final assault. The Rus held for almost an hour, but when their commander Dmitry Mstislavovich fell, all resistance collapsed. The Mongols overran the camp, slaughtering everyone they could catch. Mstislav Romanovich, the Grand Prince of Kiev, surrendered in return for a promise of safe conduct. The Mongols agreed. They would not shed the blood of princes, they said, and they kept their word technically. The chronicles describe what happened next with a kind of horrified fascination. The Mongols laid planks over Mstislav Romanovich and the 2 other princes who had surrendered with him. Then the Mongol commanders sat on the boards and ate their victory feast while the princes suffocated beneath them, slowly crushed to death under the weight. It was a grotesque mockery of their promise, a demonstration of Mongol ruthlessness that would echo through Russian memory for generations. The slaughter continued for hours. The Mongols spent the rest of the day riding down and killing fleeing Russians. Of the 80,000 warriors who had marched east so confidently, only a handful survived. The chronicles suggest 1 in 10 made it home. The losses were staggering. Most of the Rus princes engaged in the battle were killed. The military power of multiple principalities was destroyed in a single afternoon. That night, approximately 1,200 surviving Rus cavalrymen halted to rest, believing they were safe from pursuit. They were wrong. Prince Yuri Glebovich of Nesvizh halted his men to let them rest. The other princes continued their withdrawal without him. The next morning the Mongols appeared. What happened to that group isn't recorded in detail, but they were never heard from again. The Battle of the Kalka River was one of the most complete military disasters in medieval European history. The Rus had lost not just a battle, but an entire generation of military leadership, the best trained and most experienced warriors from multiple principalities. The chronicles record the aftermath with stark simplicity. And there was lamentation and weeping and grief throughout towns and villages, and the Tatars turned back from the river Dnieper, and we know not whence they came, nor where they hid themselves again. God knows whence he fetched them against us for our sins. The Mongols had achieved exactly what Yerby and Subutai intended. They had demonstrated Mongol military superiority, crushed potential resistance, gathered intelligence about the lands west of the steppe, and sent a message that would resonate across Eastern Europe. They gathered their forces, turned east, and began the long journey back to Mongolia to rejoin Genghis Khan. The Rus were left to bury their dead and contemplate what had happened. Some understood the magnitude of the disaster. This wasn't just a defeat. It was an introduction to a kind of warfare the Rus had no answer for. But for most, the immediate threat had passed. The Mongols had disappeared back into the east. Life went on. The princes went back to quarrelling and fighting among themselves as they had before. They had 13 years before the Mongols would return, and when they came back it wouldn't be a reconnaissance in force of 20,000 men. It would be a full-scale invasion designed to conquer, occupy and extract tribute from every Russian principality. The man who would lead that invasion was already preparing. Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, ruler of the western portion of the Mongol Empire. By the early 1230s, the Mongol Empire had consolidated its holdings across Asia. China was being systematically conquered. Persia had fallen. Central Asia was pacified. The Great Kurultai, the assembly of Mongol nobles, met in 1235 to plan the next phase of expansion. Europe. The campaign would be massive, comparable in scope to the war against China. Batu Khan would nominally command, as the western territories had been assigned to his family line by Genghis Khan himself. But the actual architect of the campaign would be Subutai, now in his 60s, but still the most brilliant general in the Mongol arsenal. He had scouted the route 15 years earlier. He knew the terrain, the political situation, the military capabilities of his enemies. He knew exactly where to strike and when. The Mongols prepared methodically. They gathered intelligence through traders, merchants, travellers, building detailed knowledge of European geography, politics, military strength. They recruited engineers, Chinese and Persian specialists in siege warfare, men who could build and operate the catapults and siege towers that would be needed to reduce the fortified cities of Rus. They assembled vast herds of horses. Mongol warriors typically travelled with multiple mounts, sometimes 5 or more per man, allowing them to cover vast distances without exhausting their animals. They coordinated with tribal confederations across the steppe, bringing additional forces into the army. By late 1236, Batu Khan commanded an army estimated at over 100,000 mounted warriors. The Mongols crossed the Volga River in late 1236 and invaded Volga Bulgaria. It took them only a month to extinguish the resistance of the Volga Bulgars, the Cumans, and the Alans. The remnants of the Cuman Confederation, still reeling from their defeat at the Kalka River, were shattered. Many submitted, others fled westward into Hungary, where they would later play a role in that kingdom's resistance to the Mongols. But for now, the steppes were clear. The way to Rus was open. In November 1237, a Hungarian friar named Julian reached the eastern border of Rus. He was travelling through the region gathering information, and what he learned terrified him. He met with locals who described a massive Mongol army gathering near the Voronezh River. But they weren't attacking. They were waiting for the onset of winter so that they could cross the frozen rivers and swamps. Julian wrote urgently to the Pope's legate in Hungary, warning of what was coming. He described meeting Mongol messengers who had been detained by Yuri II of Vladimir on their way to Hungary. The messengers had carried demands for submission, tribute, and vassalage. Yuri had refused, treating the Mongol envoys with disdain. In November 1237, Batu Khan sent his final embassy to the court of Yuri II. The chronicles record Yuri's response. As they did before, the messengers came, those evil bloodsuckers, saying, "Make peace with us." He did not want that. As the prophet said, "Glorious war is better than disgraceful peace." These godless men with their deceitful peace will cause great dismay to our lands, as they have already done much evil here. It was the response of a proud man defending his honour. It was also a death sentence for his principality. The Mongols waited until December, until the rivers were frozen solid, until the swamps were hard as stone, until the snow had fallen and created the perfect highways for their cavalry. Then they struck. The invasion began at Ryazan, a principality southeast of modern Moscow. The Mongol envoys approached Prince Yuri Igorovich with demands: submit, pay tribute, provide the Mongols with a tithe of everything: princes, people, horses, complete armour. The princes of Ryazan refused. They sent urgent pleas to Vladimir, to the Grand Prince Yuri II, begging for aid. "We are trying to hold them off," they wrote. "Come help us, or send your armies, or we are lost." Yuri II sent nothing. The princes of Ryazan gathered their forces and marched out to meet the Mongols at the Voronezh River, along with forces from Murom and Pronsk. They were vastly outnumbered. Contemporary sources suggest the Mongols had 12 to 14 tumens, units of 10,000 men each, giving them a nominal strength of 120 to 140,000 warriors. The Ryazan forces probably numbered a few thousand at most. The chronicles record the prince's response to the Mongol demands: "When we are gone, everything will be yours." The battle at the Voronezh River was short and brutal. The Rus forces were simply overwhelmed. The Mongols, with their superior numbers, coordination and tactical sophistication, destroyed the Ryazan army in detail. The princes fled back to their cities. The Mongols followed. On December 16th, 1237, the Mongol army arrived at the capital city of Ryazan and began the siege. The city was surrounded, enclosed by a stockade the Mongols constructed to prevent escape or relief. For 6 days the defenders held out. Prince Yuri Igorovich led the resistance personally. The Rus fought, the chronicles say, bravely. But on December 21st the Mongols broke through. What followed was one of the most horrific massacres of the medieval period. The Voskresensk Chronicle describes it in stark detail. The Tartars took the town of Ryazan and burned it all, and killed its Prince Yuri and his princess and seized the men, women and children, the monks, nuns and priests. Some they struck down with swords, while others they shot with arrows and flung into the flames. Still others they seized and bound, cut and disemboweled their bodies. The city was utterly destroyed. The entire population, thousands of people, were either killed or carried off into slavery. Ryazan would not be rebuilt for decades. News of the fall of Ryazan spread panic across the Rus principalities. But the Mongols didn't pause. Having secured their first objective, they pushed northwest toward Vladimir. Kolomna fell next, then Moscow, at the time a relatively minor town, not yet the great city it would become. Both offered minimal resistance and were quickly overwhelmed. The winter of 1237 to 1238 became a nightmare for northern Rus. The Mongols moved across the frozen landscape with terrifying speed. The frozen rivers, which the Rus had always considered barriers that protected them during winter, became highways for the Mongol cavalry. The swamps and marshlands that made movement difficult during other seasons were frozen solid, allowing the Mongols to move wherever they wished. It was the opposite of what European armies expected. Most military campaigns shut down in winter. Armies went into winter quarters, waited for spring. The Mongols thrived in winter. They came from the harsh steppes of Mongolia, where winters were far more brutal than anything Russia could offer. Their horses were hardy steppe ponies, adapted to living through the harshest conditions. Their warriors wore layers of silk under their armour, not just for protection against arrows, but for warmth. They knew how to survive and fight in conditions that would paralyse other armies. On February 4th, 1238, the Mongol army arrived at Vladimir, the capital of Vladimir Suzdal, one of the most powerful principalities in Rus. Grand Duke Yuri II, who had refused to help Ryazan, who had treated the Mongol envoys with contempt, fled the city before the Mongols arrived. He left his wife and sons to face the siege. He retreated north to gather a new army. Vladimir was one of the great cities of Rus, heavily fortified, well garrisoned. It held for 3 days. On February 7th, the Mongols breached the walls using their siege engines, catapults hurling stones and incendiary materials into the city. The cathedral was torched. The royal family perished in the flames. The city fell. Grand Duke Yuri managed to gather a new army in the forest to the north. He crossed the Volga River and prepared to march back to relieve Vladimir. But he was too late. The city had already fallen, and the Mongols were coming for him. On March 4th, 1238, the Mongol forces caught up with Yuri's army at the Sit River. The battle was over almost before it began. Yuri's hastily assembled forces were no match for the veteran Mongol warriors. The army was encircled and annihilated. Yuri himself was killed. With the Grand Duke dead, with Vladimir destroyed, the northern Rus principalities collapsed. Batu Khan divided his army into smaller columns, each tasked with conquering specific cities. It was a classic Mongol strategy, using their superior mobility and coordination to attack multiple targets simultaneously, preventing the enemy from concentrating their forces. Over the next few months, 14 cities fell: Rostov, Uglich, Yaroslavl, Kostroma, Kashin, Ksnyatin, Gorodets, Galich, Pereslavl-Zaleski, Yuriev-Polski, Dimitrov, Volokolamsk, Tver, Torzhok. Each conquest followed the same pattern. The Mongols would arrive, surround the city, demand submission. If the city surrendered, the population would be spared, though tribute would be extracted. If the city resisted, it would be destroyed, the population massacred or enslaved. Few cities surrendered. Russian pride, religious conviction, simple defiance. All of it led to resistance, and resistance led to annihilation. One small town, Kozelsk, held out for 7 weeks. The chronicles record that the boy Prince Vasily and the inhabitants killed 4,000 Mongols before the city finally fell. The Mongols were so enraged by the resistance that they called it the Evil City and slaughtered every living soul within its walls. Only 2 major cities in northern Rus escaped destruction: Novgorod and Pskov. The reasons are debated by historians. Some argue the Mongols were exhausted, that their army needed rest after months of continuous campaigning. Others suggest the terrain around Novgorod, with its forests and marshlands, even frozen, was too difficult for the Mongol cavalry. Some think the spring thaw was approaching, and the Mongols feared getting caught. in the Rasputitsa, the season of mud, when the ground becomes an impassable morass. Whatever the reason, Novgorod was spared. It would prove crucial for the preservation of Russian culture and governance in the years to come. By spring of 1238, northern Rus was devastated. Entire cities lay in ruins. The military power of the major principalities had been destroyed. Tens of thousands were dead. The survivors faced starvation, as the Mongol campaign had destroyed the agricultural infrastructure, burned the stores of grain, slaughtered the livestock. Refugees fled in all directions, many to the northeast, into the forest regions with poor soil between the northern Volga and Oka rivers. But the Mongols weren't finished. After resting and regrouping through the summer of 1238, Batu Khan resumed his campaign. He devastated the Crimea, pacified Mordovia. In the winter of 1239, he sacked Chernigov and Pereyaslav. In December 1240, after a prolonged siege, the Mongols stormed Kiev, the ancient capital of Rus, the city from which Kievan Rus had taken its name. Despite fierce resistance, Kiev fell. The city was sacked, burned, its population massacred. The chronicles describe it as the end of Kievan Rus as a political entity. The state that had dominated Eastern Europe for centuries was gone, fractured into petty principalities that would spend the next 2 centuries as vassals of the Mongol Golden Horde. From Kiev, the Mongols pushed west into Galicia-Volhynia. Despite the fierce resistance of Prince Danilo, they took Halych and Volodymyr Volinsky. By 1241 they had reached Hungary and Poland, where they would fight the battles of Legnica and Mohi, victories that left Europe reeling. Only the death of Ögedei Khan in 1241 saved the rest of Europe. The Mongol princes and commanders, including Batu Khan and Subutai, were required to return to Mongolia for the Kurultai to elect the next great Khan. The invasion stopped. Europe breathed a collective sigh of relief, but for the Rus, the invasion didn't end. It transformed into something more insidious: occupation. The Mongol Golden Horde established its capital at Sarai on the lower Volga and demanded tribute from all the Russian principalities. The system they imposed was brutal but efficient. Each principality was required to conduct a census, counting every household, every source of wealth. Based on these censuses, tribute was calculated and collected regularly. The Mongol agents, supported by Russian princes who collaborated to maintain their own power, ensured the system functioned smoothly. Any principality that refused to pay faced punitive raids, devastation, the destruction of cities. The Russian chronicles called this period the Tatar Yoke, and it would last for nearly 2.5 centuries. The psychological impact was profound. Russian identity, culture, religion, all of it was shaped by the experience of Mongol domination. The Orthodox Church was largely exempted from tribute, as the Mongols, for superstitious or practical reasons, chose not to interfere with religious institutions. This allowed the Church to gain enormous influence during the period. The Principality of Moscow, initially a minor player in Russian politics, began its rise to dominance during this period, largely by serving as the most reliable tax collector for the Mongols. The Mongol occupation also had long-term political consequences. Some historians argue that the fracturing of Rus under Mongol rule led directly to the emergence of 3 separate Eastern Slavic nations, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, each developing distinct identities during the centuries of Mongol domination. The military lessons were profound as well. The Russian princes had been shattered by an enemy that fought in ways they couldn't counter. The Mongol tactical system, based on mobility, archery, coordination, and psychological warfare, was so superior to European methods that it took centuries for the balance to shift. It wasn't until the Battle of Kulikovo in 1380 that a Russian army, led by Prince Dmitry Donskoy of Moscow, defeated a Mongol force in open battle. Even then, it wasn't the end of Mongol power. The Golden Horde continued to demand tribute until 1480, when Ivan III of Moscow finally refused to pay, and the Mongols, weakened by internal divisions and external threats, couldn't enforce their demands. The Great Stand on the Ugra River in 1480 marked the final end of the Tatar yoke. But by that point, Russia had been shaped, fundamentally and irrevocably, by 2.5 centuries of Mongol domination. When we look back at the Mongol invasions of Rus, 2 moments stand out: the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223 and the winter invasion of 1237 to 1238. Both demonstrated the same tactical and strategic principles, that made the Mongols the most formidable military force of the medieval world. First, intelligence and reconnaissance. The Mongols never fought blind. They gathered detailed information about their enemies, the terrain, the political situation. Jebi and Subutai spent 3 years scouting the Western Territories before the Battle of the Kalka River. When Batu Khan invaded, he knew exactly where to strike, when to strike, and what forces would oppose him. Second, mobility. The Mongol reliance on cavalry, on hardy steppe ponies that could survive on minimal fodder, on warriors who could ride for days without rest, gave them an operational tempo that European armies couldn't match. They could concentrate forces faster, strike unexpected targets, withdraw before the enemy could respond. The winter invasion exploited this to perfection, using the frozen rivers as highways, moving across terrain that should have protected the Rus. Third, tactical sophistication. The feigned retreat, the enveloping maneuver, the concentration of fire, all of it required discipline, training and coordination far beyond what most medieval armies possessed. Mongol warriors trained from childhood in the great hunts, learning to work as units, to follow complex commands, to adapt to changing battlefield conditions. The decimal organization system with units of 10, 100, 1,000 and 10,000 allowed for clear chains of command and rapid communication. Fourth, firepower. The composite bow was the machine gun of its era. It could penetrate armor at ranges European bows couldn't match, could be fired rapidly from horseback, could concentrate fire to create zones of destruction that shattered enemy formations. The Mongols understood massed fire in ways Europeans didn't. Fifth, siege warfare. The Mongols recruited Chinese and Persian engineers who brought advanced siege techniques to Europe decades before they would otherwise arrive. The use of catapults in field battles, the construction of siege towers and battering rams, the coordination of assaults, all of it was far beyond what European armies of the time could manage. Sixth, psychological warfare. The Mongols cultivated terror deliberately. The massacres, the grotesque treatment of captured leaders, the systematic destruction of cities that resisted, all of it was designed to spread fear, to encourage surrender, to break enemy morale before battle was even joined. Finally, strategic patience. The Mongols didn't rush. They prepared carefully, gathered intelligence, waited for the right moment. The winter invasion was a masterpiece of timing, exploiting the frozen landscape to gain mobility advantages, striking when the Rus were least prepared. Together, these elements created a military system that was essentially unbeatable by the armies of 13th century Europe. The Rus learned this at terrible cost. At the Kalka River, 80,000 warriors were destroyed by 20,000. In the winter invasion, the entire military power of northern Rus, tens of thousands of fighting men, was annihilated in a matter of months. The psychological impact lasted centuries. Russian chronicles from the period are filled with lamentation, with descriptions of the Mongols as divine punishment for sin, as an apocalyptic force beyond human understanding. It would be generations before Russian princes could field armies capable of challenging Mongol power. In some ways, they never truly did. The Golden Horde collapsed more from internal divisions and external pressures than from Russian military resistance. But the legacy of those frozen river campaigns lived on. The Russian state that emerged from Mongol domination was fundamentally different from the Kievan Rus that had existed before, more centralized, more autocratic, more militarized. Some historians argue that the Tsarist autocracy that would dominate Russia for centuries was shaped in part by the Mongol model of governance, the emphasis on absolute central authority, on bureaucratic tax collection, on ruthless suppression of dissent. The Battle of the Kalka River and the winter invasion stand as monuments to the Mongol military system at its peak. 20,000 men defeating 80,000. 140,000 men conquering an entire civilization in a single winter. Using frozen rivers as highways, turning the Russian winter from a defensive barrier into an offensive weapon. It was warfare as the Rus had never seen it. Warfare that would reshape Eastern Europe for centuries. The chronicles record that after the sack of Kiev in 1240, only 200 houses remained standing in what had been one of Europe's greatest cities. The population that had numbered in the tens of thousands was reduced to scattered survivors. The Cathedral of St. Sophia, one of the architectural wonders of medieval Europe, was looted and partially destroyed. The Mongol victory was so complete, so devastating, that some scholars have argued it fundamentally altered the trajectory of European history, If the Mongols hadn't stopped their advance in 1241, if they had continued west after conquering Hungary and Poland, it's entirely possible they could have overrun the fragmented kingdoms of Western Europe as easily as they had crushed the Rus principalities. The comparative military capabilities certainly suggest this was possible, but they stopped, and the Rus were left to rebuild from the ashes. In the centuries that followed, Russian historians and chroniclers would look back on the Mongol invasions as a defining trauma, a moment when their civilization came within a hairbreadth of extinction. The chronicles are filled with bitter reflections on what might have been, if the princes had united, if Yuri had sent aid to Ryazan, if the Grand Prince of Kiev hadn't sat on his fortified hill and watched his allies die at the Kalka River. If, but they didn't. And the Mongol horsemen, masters of the frozen rivers, the winter steppes, the art of war itself, had crushed them utterly. The thunder of Mongol hooves across the frozen Kalka, across the ice highways of northern Rus, echoed through Russian memory for centuries. It echoes still. The echoes of that thunder would haunt the Rus for centuries to come, reverberating through their culture, their identity, and their very sense of self. The Mongol invasion had shattered not only the physical defences of the Rus principalities, but also their psychological armour. For the generations that followed, the memory of the Mongol conquest would shape the way the Rus saw themselves and the world around them. It would shape their politics, their military strategies, and even their spirituality. In the aftermath of the invasion, the Rus were left with a broken, fragmented state. The unified power that had once been Kievan Rus was no more. The principalities were weak and divided, their leaders engaged in constant infighting and rivalries. The Mongol occupation would serve to deepen these fractures, as the Mongols themselves fostered division to better control their subjects. In return for paying tribute, local princes were given a degree of autonomy, if they were loyal. If they rebelled, they were crushed. The Mongol presence in the Rus was not just an occupation in the traditional sense, but a form of indirect rule, where the Mongols extracted tribute through local intermediaries. For those princes who aligned themselves with the Mongols, the reward was power. The most notable example of this was the rise of the Principality of Moscow. Initially a small and relatively insignificant territory, Moscow began to rise through the ranks, leveraging its position as the primary tax collector for the Mongols. Over time, the Grand Princes of Moscow used their growing wealth and influence to dominate the Rus. The Mongols, for their part, welcomed this consolidation of power, as it made the collection of tribute more efficient and less prone to disruption. But this system also had the unintended consequence of laying the groundwork for the eventual unification of the Rus under Moscow's leadership. The Mongols, for all their might and terror, had not fully realized the seeds of unity they were planting. The princes of Moscow, who had once been little more than one of many minor rulers in a fractured landscape, would go on to build an empire that would eventually challenge and overcome Mongol dominance. But that would be a long time coming, and the process of recovery and rebuilding would take centuries. One of the most striking elements of the Mongol occupation was the way it reshaped Russian identity. Under the Mongols, the Rus had to adapt. The military defeat was so total that many Russians began to see the Mongols as a form of divine punishment, an expression of God's wrath for their sins. The chroniclers of the time often framed the invasions as a form of divine retribution for the pride, greed, and infighting of the Rus princes. This religious interpretation, though deeply bitter and sorrowful, would shape the way the Rus viewed their place in the world for centuries. The Orthodox Church, for all the destruction around it, came through the invasion relatively unscathed. The Mongols were pragmatic, and they saw the value in maintaining a stable religious system in the regions they controlled. The Church, in turn, became a pillar of Russian society, not only preserving religious faith, but also becoming a centre of education and administration. This, too, would play a role in Moscow's eventual rise, as the Orthodox Church would lend its legitimacy to the Moscow princes. Mongol rule also left a profound mark on Russian governance. The centralized bureaucracy that the Mongols introduced, the strict census-taking, the system of tribute collection, and the reliance on a small, powerful group of rulers at the top, became the model for the Russian state for centuries. This is especially true of Moscow, which adopted many Mongol administrative practices in its own governance. The concept of absolute power concentrated in the hands of a single ruler, unchallenged and supreme, would become a hallmark of Russian autocracy, culminating in the reign of the Tsars. However, it was not just the political structure that was influenced by the Mongols, but also military practices. The Mongols had demonstrated the effectiveness of mounted archers, of highly mobile forces that could strike quickly, retreat, and regroup. The Rus in time would adopt many of these practices, though they would never fully replicate the Mongols' mastery of cavalry warfare. It wasn't until the rise of Ivan the Terrible in the 16th century that Russia would begin to create a military capable of holding its own against the Mongols. But even as the Mongols left their indelible mark on the Rus, the story of their invasion is also a story of missed opportunities. The chroniclers, in their lamentations, often expressed regret for the failures of the princes who could not unite in the face of the Mongol threat. If only they had set aside their differences, some suggested, the Rus could have defeated the invaders, just as the Mongols had been defeated in other parts of the world. But the fragmentation, the petty rivalries, and the deep-seated distrust between the princes led to a failure to mount a unified defence. This lesson, though learned the hard way, would stay with the Rus for generations. The idea of unity, of working together for the greater good, would become a central theme in Russian thought, especially in the years when Moscow emerged as the dominant power in the region. The Russian national myth would come to centre on the idea of the gathering of the Russian lands under Moscow, the rise of a single, powerful, united Russia that would stand as a bulwark against foreign invaders. It was a myth born of suffering, a myth that justified the autocratic power of the Tsars and the centralization of the Russian state. The story of the Mongol invasion also became a formative narrative for Russian nationalism. In the years to come, the memory of the Tatar yoke, the humiliating tribute payments, the subjugation of the Rus to foreign masters would fuel a desire for revenge. The idea of the Mongol as an external alien force would become intertwined with the Russian sense of identity, feeding the narrative of Russia as the eternal victim of foreign oppression and the eventual avenger of past wrongs. The eventual expulsion of the Mongols in the late 15th century, culminating in the victory of Ivan III, Ivan the Great, over the Golden Horde, would be seen as the final vindication of the Russian people. The struggle against the Mongols was over, but the scars remained, shaping Russian society, politics, and culture in ways that would last long into the future. But even as the Mongol invasions became a chapter in Russia's distant past, the legacy of their military genius would not be forgotten. Mongol tactics, mobility, and intelligence gathering would continue to be studied by military strategists and leaders for centuries. The terror that they instilled would be remembered as a symbol of absolute military might. And for the Russian people, the echoes of those long-ago battles would resonate in the very bones of their national identity. Echoes of a time when their lands were overrun, their cities burned, and their warriors defeated, but also echoes of a people who endured, who rebuilt, and who eventually triumphed over their conquerors. The Mongol invasion of Rus was not just a war. It was a transformative event that reshaped the very fabric of Russian history. It was a lesson in the power of unity, the costs of division, and the resilience of a people who, though crushed under the weight of Mongol hooves, would rise again to forge a new future. It was a tale of loss and recovery, of devastation and rebirth, and it was a story that would never be forgotten.